Hi everybody, I'm KHOU 11 Meteorologist Pat Cavlin coming to you from Houston, Texas. It is Sunday, September 25th, 2022. And here is the latest information on Tropical Storm Ian. Brand new update just coming in. It is a 60-mile-per-hour storm. It's moving to the northwest at about 12 miles per hour, so not a lot has changed since we spoke this time last night. However, a lot has changed in the last 3 hours. The 4 p.m. update showed this as a 45-mile-per-hour tropical storm. Now it's up to 60 miles per hour. So why the change? Well, as we take off the tropical icon and we just show you the satellite image, notice that big blob there in the middle, that white and gray blob. That indicates a big burst of thunderstorm activity. And that thunderstorm activity is located almost exactly over the center of circulation for this storm. Ian's been struggling pretty much all day long. Even though the atmospheric conditions were ripe for further development today, it didn't happen because those thunderstorms were removed from or displaced from the center of circulation. You don't have a healthy storm unless everything is stacked on top of each other. That is starting to happen now. So that's a bad sign because that is a sign that we are finally going to start to see this thing get its act together and organize and potentially rapidly intensify. If not through the overnight, then definitely as we get into the day tomorrow. So what is going to help to fuel this thing? Well, as we look at the wider shot, again, doesn't really look healthy. It looks pretty ragged. But really, you got to focus on what's going on in the center, that big burst of convection that's concerning. So what lies ahead for this storm? Some really warm water. And not just warm surface water temperatures. We're talking about deep warm water, and that's going to provide this thing for a ton of fuel as we go through the next 24 to 36 hours. The darker the red here, the deeper that warm water goes, and so the more likely it is we see for this thing to potentially develop as it moves over that warm water. So where does the forecast track go in relation to that warm water? Right overhead. I mean, right through the Yucatan Channel, right over the west coast of Cuba. So here we go. There's the forecast track. The warmest of the water is just to the west, but still we're going over some pretty toasty water temperatures. And again, really deep water. So this is not a good sign. This is all the fuel that this system is going to need to kind of explode here as we go through the next 24 to 36 hours. So this is not looking good for the west coast of Cuba, and it is not looking good for our friends in Florida. All right, here's the latest forecast track from the National Hurricane Center. Hurricane warnings in effect for the Cayman Islands, for the Isle of Youth, for the west coast of Cuba. Notice nothing just to the west across the Yucatan Peninsula. The reason for that, remember, the bad side of a hurricane is always on the east side. So even though we're almost equidistant in terms of impacts between Havana and Cancun, we are going to see the worst impacts there on the east side, the right-hand side of that storm. All right, let's break down the timing. We're still dealing with a 60-mile-per-hour storm. By Monday afternoon, as of this current forecast package, they're expecting this to be a Category 1 hurricane, wind sustained at 80 miles per hour. My inkling is, in the later forecast package that's going to come out in a few hours, I bet they actually increase that value. I bet we see this thing intensify a little faster. They're probably kind of going a little more conservative just based on how the storm is behaving during the day today. But now that we're seeing that big burst of convection, now that we saw that big jump in the wind speeds, I bet we see this thing as a Cat 1 potentially by tomorrow morning instead of tomorrow afternoon. Bottom line though, we're dealing with a major Category 3 storm as it moves on shore across the west coast of Cuba. Either moves on shore or passes just to the west. Still a big deal for Cuba. Again, to the west of Havana, we're talking about big-time rainfalls, big-time storm surge, and the potential also for some damaging winds in excess of 120 miles per hour. After that, the next stop is the United States. Exactly where in the United States still remains to be seen, but we've got our first tropical storm watches now in effect for the lower and the middle Keys in Florida. Still nothing for the Florida West Coast. The reason for that is just timing. The National Hurricane Center issues these products, these watches and warnings, based on timing. So we're still too far out to see these watches and warnings go up for any of the Florida mainland. I guarantee you're going to start to see that come through as we get into Monday afternoon, Monday evening, and especially as we head into Tuesday, because by that point, we're going to be in a pretty small time window, about 24 to 48 hours for potential impacts coming on shore. So look what happens here. We still have a pretty wide envelope of possibilities extending from Fort Myers here in southwest Florida, still all the way up towards Pensacola. Now remember, this is still going off of the 4 p.m. Central Time, the 5 p.m. Eastern Time forecast advisory. The next forecast cone comes out later tonight. That's going to probably be adjusted, almost guaranteed, both in intensity and also in track. They're going to fine-tune that track a little more. But still a lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty has been with us pretty much all day long because the storm hasn't been well organized. Remember, the computer models are only as good as the input, the information going into them. Bad information going into the model, bad information comes out. If the center of the storm and the storm itself isn't well formed, then the models are going to have a hard time pinpointing exactly where it goes. But I do have a suspicion that we're going to get a better idea as we get into the day on Monday. Bottom line though, very dangerous storm, passing about 150 miles to the west of Key West as a Cat 4 hurricane with winds sustained at 130 miles per hour. Watch what happens here though. It starts to weaken as it gets closer to the Big Bend of Florida. The reason for that is a big trough in the jet stream, a big dip in the jet stream, and that's going to introduce this storm to a lot of wind shear, and that will hopefully weaken things as it gets closer to land. The problem though is regardless of what happens as it gets closer to land, whether it weakens or not, storm surge is going to be a major concern. The reason for that, we are expecting this to be a Cat 4 hurricane. That's going to churn things up pretty much until this thing makes landfall, regardless if it weakens or not after the fact. So a pretty impactful storm on the way for the west coast of Florida as we get into the upcoming week. All right, so not only has the track changed, but we've also seen a change in the intensity forecast. If you remember this time yesterday, we were talking about this thing already being a hurricane Sunday night into Monday. Doesn't look like that's going to be the case for now because it had such a hard time getting its act together today. We do expect some sort of rapid intensification as we get into Monday to Tuesday. That's the current time frame. With the updated forecast later tonight, they move that window up just depending on how this storm evolves over the next few hours. Bottom line, we are expecting rapid intensification from this storm. And once that happens, we could see a hurricane as early as Monday morning, and then again tops out as a Cat 3 or 4 hurricane. So that's the difference in intensity. And again, the difference in that intensity forecast because of how hard the storm kind of struggled during the day today. We also saw a bit of a difference in the forecast cone. If you remember Saturday evening, we were talking about the fact that the models had started to nudge to the west, and that the hurricane forecast cone took a very small track to the west, or at least it opened up to a little more uncertainty. And that's because the Hurricane Center, when they change a forecast, they move like they're in honey. They move really slow. They're not going to change the forecast based on every single model run that comes out, because sometimes one run that comes out can go west, and then the next one that comes out goes right back to the east. So it's just kind of a blip in the radar, right? Well, wouldn't you know it, the models have actually gone back to the east. So these were the plots that we were looking at yesterday. We had a pretty wide range of possibilities going from Tampa all the way to the Florida Panhandle on the border of Alabama. Look at where they are today. Much more tightly packed and much more focused on either the Big Bend of Florida or Southwest Florida going up to the Tampa Bay area. So there's better consensus, which means that there is better confidence, there's higher confidence that this is going to be a either Big Bend coast Florida storm or a West Coast Florida storm. Bottom line, big time impacts here for the West Coast of Florida from the Naples area, Marco Island, all the way up through Fort Myers, getting into Port Charlotte, and getting into the Tampa Bay area, including Sarasota. All right, let's take two of our main models here, the GFS, which is the American model, in yellow, and the European model, that's in red. We'll just take these two lines and we'll show you what's going to happen. As we get into the day on Monday, they're in pretty good agreement, both timing-wise, because they're pretty much in the same position, and both location-wise. I mean, they're almost on top of each other. There's maybe about a 20-mile difference here. Let's play the animation. We'll get you into the day on Wednesday. We'll stop the clock right there. Look at how close they are. They actually crisscross paths. So really good agreement up to this point as to where these models are going. The timing is also dead on. So Wednesday, we're looking at a storm pretty much in line with Southwest Florida, in line with the Fort Myers and Naples area as we get into Wednesday. What happens beyond that? Looks like there's a little more agreement now. Some subtle divergence, but overall, both of the deterministic or operational models take this storm, again, anywhere from Tampa up towards the Big Bend coast. That is looking more and more likely at this point, as of Sunday evening, that the trajectory of this storm is going to take. That could change still, but it looks like we're starting to narrow that field of possibilities. It was a huge field yesterday. It's starting to narrow down now, and it does look like this is going to be a storm that impacts that area. And exactly how strong it is going to depend upon where it makes landfall, how far north it makes it, and how much it interacts with that trough in the jet stream. So here you go, just to kind of lay it out for you with more than just a line, with actually rain on the map, with the surface pressure. You could see again the American model here in the blue box. This is just off the Tampa coastline on Wednesday. European, couple miles closer, but overall same picture. So really good agreement. This is the first time we've actually seen this kind of good agreement in the models since we've been tracking this storm. Let's get you more of a local look at what the next 60 hours look like for this system. So Monday morning here, watch the clock up on the top hand right of the screen. There are the Cayman Islands. Center of circulation passes probably about 100 miles to the west of the Cayman Islands. But remember, east side of the storm, the dirty side. So we're talking about persistent rain bands moving onshore. We're talking about storm surge potential. We're talking about strong damage, wind gusts, and potential even for a few tornadoes. That's the worst side of the storm. Cayman Islands going to really see a pretty impactful day as we get into Monday. Next stop, we'll stop the clock there. Late Monday night, early Tuesday morning, this thing is roaring ashore out towards the Isle of Youth and the west coast of Cuba. Cancun, sun shining. So a big difference here. I mean, just a couple hundred miles, we're talking about the worst part of the storm extending all the way through parts of central Cuba, including Havana, Isle of Youth, west coast, and again, that persistent onshore flow, that persistent movement of wind from south to north is going to take all of the water here in the Caribbean and pile it onshore. So storm surge, a big concern here for the south end of the western part of Cuba. Could see some big-time storm surge with this. Big-time wind, mudslides, flash flooding. Not a good situation for the island nation. What happens after that? We'll keep the animation going. Key West. Notice, you're going to come real close to this. This is something that we got to keep a very close eye on. Even though you're technically out of the forecast cone, you're only 100 miles to the east of the center of circulation. And that's going right up the middle. From the edge of the forecast cone to Key West, we're probably talking about 50 to 75 miles. So it's going to be a close call here. So that track can nudge a little farther to the west or to the east. So again, Key West, you've got a tropical storm watch right now. They could upgrade that depending on what the newest forecast tracks show later tonight. But really, it's going to be Fort Myers. It's going to be Port Charlotte. It's going to be Sarasota, Bradenton, Tampa. Those are the areas that are really going to have to watch this now as we get into Wednesday. But watch what's starting to happen here. Notice we've got all of this clearing off to the west. We're starting to get these huge rain bands extending all the way across the state. This is overnight Tuesday into Wednesday morning. So what's happening here? That's the wind shear at work. That jet stream is going to be dipping in that direction, right? So these are the upper level winds, the same altitude that the jets fly. These come howling in, and they are starting to shred the top of this storm away. And this is where that weakening could happen. Bottom line though, we're talking about a Category 4 storm at this point. I know it's kind of faint, but there's the official forecast of the National Hurricane Center. Category 4 hurricane, regardless of any weakening that happens, the Gulf of Mexico is getting churned up. We're talking about big time waves, big time storm surge potential here. Because remember, we're on the east side of the storm here for Florida. So the entire Florida west coast here, you're going to be seeing that onshore flow. So we're talking about storm surge, we're talking about flooding potential, tornado potential, dirty side of the storm. Pretty much the worst part of the storm will be going through that area as we get into Tuesday night and Wednesday. All right, we'll take you back south for a minute. We're still expecting the potential again for flash flooding and mudslides. The Cayman Islands, and then from Havana all the way towards the west, to the west end of the island. And then on top of that, like I mentioned, storm surge, hurricane force winds, big potential. Cancun, a couple showers. So big difference here because of that track passing just to the east of the Yucatan Peninsula. All right, let's talk more about the storm surge potential though and the wave heights that we're going to see on the west coast of Florida. Remember, regardless of any type of weakening that happens just before landfall, this is going to be one of the biggest stories. And why is that? It has to do with the shape of the coastline. It has to do with the direction the storm is moving into the area. Notice all of the winds here howling onshore. So that takes all of the water in the Gulf of Mexico, and actually let me change the color so it's easier to see. So all the winds moving that direction, okay? That takes all of the water in the Gulf of Mexico and it piles it right there along the coastal spots. And the reason why, and this part of the United States is one of the most susceptible areas in the country to storm surge. And the reason for that is because the continental shelf, okay, the sand beneath your feet under the water on that side of the state extends out at a shallow depth for at least 150 miles, which means you take that water from deeper depths and you put it over that shallow depth, it's got nowhere to go but inland. Whereas on the Atlantic side, it's a quick drop off. A couple miles offshore and that drops off quick. So the water has somewhere to go that isn't onshore. Different story, West Coast. So again, places like Fort Myers, up towards Charlotte Harbor, up towards Tampa Bay, big time impacts with storm surge here, depending on, well actually independent of any type of weakening that happens with this system. And we're talking about wave heights here too. I mean, look at the coloring with this. We're in the 20 to 30 foot range for waves out over the middle of the Gulf underneath the worst of the storm. But this is the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, if you've ever been to the Gulf of Mexico, it's like a lake some days with no waves at all, especially the farther south you get. So some really big time impacts here for the beaches and for coastal homes on the west coast of Florida here as we get into the middle and the end of the week. So this is the bottom line. And I took the intensity off the track. I took the daytimes off because really what you have to take away here is we still have a pretty wide possibility, a pretty wide envelope of possibilities as of this evening, extending all the way from the Keys up to the Panhandle, because that's how far west that track goes. But the worst of it, even if this thing takes a track in this direction, you're still going to see impacts along the west coast because of the storm surge potential and because of those big outer rain bands. So a lot to digest here. We are going to keep following the latest on the storm. Bottom line, now is the time to be prepared. That is the latest, though, on Tropical Storm Ian. As we get into the day on Monday, this storm is going to look a lot different. We're going to have a new update for you. Please keep following us along. We keep doing these updates for you on this YouTube channel. You can also follow along on social media for the latest. Thanks for watching.